Hello and welcome to the Roundtable Podcast. My name is Rafi. Today I'm joined by Shogun. We're going to be talking about Warhammer. Please join the Roundtable Discord where we do this podcast every day. Roundtable voice chats, discussions, everything. Please follow us on BitChute and everything else. We are going to be talking about the deep, rich, horrifying, and rewarding lore of Warhammer 40k universe. Whether you are a current fan of 40k or not, don't miss this. So, Shogun, without further ado, where would you like to start us off on Warhammer 40k?
Thanks, Rafi, for having me on the show. So this is a fun episode for me because I love thinking about Warhammer 40,000 lore, and I'm certainly not the only one. It is a video game series. It is a book and novel series. It's a comic book series. It's a movie and animation series. It's a tabletop game series. It's an RPG series. But for people like me, it's all about what's called the lore. And the lore is what we call the canon, and the canon is what becomes the official timeline or history of an evolving metaverse called the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And first of all, you have to distinguish Warhammer 40,000 from its also excellent counterpart, Warhammer Fantasy, right? So we're talking about Warhammer 40,000, which is the science fiction version. Warhammer Fantasy would have to be a completely different podcast all on its own, so we're not going to talk about that. Now, this is like an impossible task because the reason it's called Warhammer 40k is because the year is approximately M40,000, meaning there's been 40,000 years of imperial history. And actually, there's some uncertainty about this because there's a dispute about whether we're in M38 to M42. But the point is, this is a very long period of time. So we can't cover it all. The earliest sort of history that we know is called the War in Heaven. In the War in Heaven, a race of beings called the Great Old Ones, or the Slan, made war against a group of star gods called the Satan. They're called star gods. They were incredibly powerful parasitic beings who would feed on stars and become incredibly powerful. So they had an ancient war, and in the process of that war, the old ones used genetic engineering to create many of the modern races of the current Warhammer 40,000 universe, such as the Eldar, who are like space elves, the orcs, formerly called Quark, but these are space orcs, and possibly others as well, because they created them as weapons against the Catan. The old ones have since disappeared. Nobody knows where they have gone. Now, the story from here, that's just like prelude, basically. The real story is the story of humanity. So humanity's story begins on Terra, which is what we call Earth. But at this time, there's already been an interstellar empire of humans that has spread far and wide and covered many thousands or millions of planets. But there's been a great catastrophe since that time called the Age of Night, or the Age of Strife. And in that period of time, this formerly great human empire that existed in what's called the Dark Age of Technology was destroyed and collapsed for a number of reasons. Huge warp storms interfered with interstellar psychers began manifesting gates into chaos, but also there was a rebellion of an artificially intelligent race called the Men of Iron, or the Men of Stone. So this was like an AI war. This is all prior to the current even beginning of the timeline. So Earth still exists. Earth itself is fractured, but in the past there was actually a post-Earth civilization that's since been fractured again. Now into this comes the character of the God Emperor of Mankind. And really the only way to tell the story of Warhammer 40,000 is as the story of the God Emperor of Mankind. He is the protagonist of the story, if you want to have one, I would say. Now, who exactly is he? Nobody really knows. He's immortal. He's what's called a perpetual, so he can never die. And even if he did die, he would reincarnate. So he can never be actually destroyed. We know he existed since before Jesus. He was one of Jesus' apostles. And he's guided humanity secretly for thousands of years. And he's the most powerful psyker who's ever existed. Now, at a certain point, Earth was fractured and there was all this war. He decided to step up and become the God Emperor of Mankind. So he basically created what he called at the time Thunder Warriors, which were his first generation of genetically engineered super warriors. And he used them basically to take over the planet Earth and unify it under one government. He then killed his own Thunder Warriors because they were defective, basically. So he made up a story where they died valiantly, but he actually exterminated them himself because they were flawed, but they had accomplished their purpose. He then created what are called the Space Marines. The Space Marines were created from the genetic material of the Emperor's 20 sons. So the Emperor created 20 sons out of his semen and his will and his spiritual power and science, each of whom were demigods, as he was a god, each of them representing a different aspect of his personality. For example, Rabaut Guilliman was the Primarch of the Ultramarines, Lionel Johnson is the Primarch of the Dark Angels, Kusaro Khan is the Primarch of the White Scars, etc., etc. So there's a Primarch of each legion, and 20 legions of Space Marines created from the genetic material of each Primarch, each of whom are created from fragments of the genetic material of the God Emperor himself. So these are his 20 sons, and each of them are intended to be put in charge of one legion of Space Marines, which will be needed for what is called the Great Crusade, which is to reunify the lost human empire and basically conquer the Milky Way galaxy. However, the great gods of chaos interfere and basically steal away all of the Primarchs and scatter them through space and time, basically. So the Emperor loses all of his Primarchs, but he still has his Space Marines based on their genetic material. And these legions are huge and unbelievably powerful. These guys are superhuman. They have 2 hearts. They wear this crazy power armor. They're very powerful. They're like 7 feet tall, 8 feet tall. They conquer space in the process, having to liberate humans that have been long lost from Xenos, which are like aliens of all different kinds, as well as chaos, which is an important concept. But basically, chaos is the first thing you kind of need to understand. So there's real space, which is called the materium, but then there's also something called the immaterium, or the warp. And the immaterium is basically real, but not physical, and it's created and influenced by the emotional and psychic resonance of the real world, and in particular conscious beings and particular beings with souls. So what that means is that every conscious feeling or sensation, thought, desire, or belief that any conscious being that has a soul has will create a resonance in the warp. And over time, those can coalesce and even become sentient. And the worst example of this is that some of humanity's most depraved and evil impulses have actually created what are called chaos gods, which are conscious sentient entities that exist in the warp and are personifications of things like bloodlust in the case of Khorne, depravity in the case of Slaanesh, ambition in the case of Zenith, or decay or gluttony in the case of Nurgle. And those are the 4 great gods of chaos, who collectively have the realm of chaos. Now, this is important because in order for humans to even travel between the stars, the only way that they can do this is by making warp jumps. So they actually have to go into the Empyrean, or the realm of chaos, to make warp jumps that are faster than the speed of light. But they can only do this because they have what's called a Geller field, which creates like a micro bubble of reality around them as they travel through the warp. And the best way to describe the warp is it's like hell if hell was on DMT all the time. That's basically what it is. And so,
just real quick, while you're talking about the technology around warp travel, do you want to talk about the rest of like the technology and stuff that is like the physics that they use in like space travel and their like weapons and stuff, so we have an understanding of like what type of reality we're working in?
Well, I mean, the Imperium has the largest military force in the universe, and the most powerful part of that is the Imperial Navy, which is thousands of spaceships, and these spaceships are like miles in diameter and miles in length. Like, they're incredibly huge. Like, you can't even really fathom how big they are. And but the point is, these have to travel faster than the speed of light, and they're heavily armed and armored and so forth, of course. But the point is that they can't just do like a faster than light jump like in Star Wars or Star Trek. They actually have to travel through a spiritual dimension full of demons, and that's basically hell. And the only thing that makes this possible is this little bubble of protection, which if it ever fails, even for a second, then literal pandemonium and hell will be unleashed, and you can be tortured forever, or like anything could happen, you know. So it's an extremely dark situation in that regard. And the only reason that people can even travel through the warp is because of the Astronomicon. And the Astronomicon is a cosmic lighthouse, which is basically created by the Golden Throne. And the Golden Throne is where the Emperor sits. It's literally his Golden Throne. And the light that the Astronomicon broadcasts, like a lighthouse, is the light of his own soul. So his soul is so bright that in the warp, it's like this incredible light, brighter than a million suns. So that no matter where you are, you can always see where the Emperor is because his soul is so bright. And if you have witch sight or third eye, you can always see him no matter where you are, so you can navigate. But the point is, at this point, they use warp travel to reclaim all these former colonies, and basically everywhere they go, they almost immediately submit to him. Sometimes he has to fight them or defeat something, but generally when they meet him, they automatically recognize him as God because he's obviously God. So the only problem the Great Crusade is going extremely well. He's created an empire of over 1 million worlds. He's conquering everything. They have incredibly advanced technology. They're defeating all these aliens, et cetera, et cetera. He's got these 20 Primarchs, and each time he finds them, they've already become the leaders of these planets, because no matter where they land, they always become the leaders of these planets because they're Primarchs. And so he ends up with all his Primarchs and his legions, and he's taken over the universe. But he realizes that as long as he needs to rely on the warp, he'll never be truly secure because the warp is inherently chaotic and he is a being of order. So what he wants to do is access something called the Webway, and the Webway is owned and operated by the species called the Eldar. And the Eldar are an older, more intelligent, and more advanced species than humans, who are equivalent to what we might think of as space elves. And in the past, they had a galactic empire that surpasses the modern human empire, even at its peak. They had god-level technology. They didn't have to work. They lived thousands of years. They're super psychic. They could turn suns on and off. They were just they'd beaten the game, basically. Unfortunately, they eventually created Slaanesh, one of the 4 great gods of chaos, and the birth scream of Slaanesh essentially ripped the souls out of billions of Eldar and destroyed the core of their empire. So now they're not nearly as powerful as they used to be, but they still have something called the Webway. And the Webway is a non-warp-based method of faster-than-light travel that is orderly, and they can actually use it without the risk of traveling through the warp. But humanity doesn't have access to it. So the God Emperor said, well, listen, the Great Crusade is going really well, but I need to do something really important back on Terra. So Horus, my favorite son and Primarch, why don't you become the War Master and continue the Great Crusade, and I'm going to go back to Terra, and I'm going to work on a top-secret project that's really important. So he did this, and this essentially becomes the seeds of what's called the Horus Heresy, because Horus, as the new War Master, becomes resentful that his father has apparently abandoned the Great Crusade and is no longer taking an active role in it and allowing them to die, and actually seemingly putting them in situations where they will suffer heavy losses and not be properly resupplied. And he's basically pushing them and not supporting them, basically. And so they create these lodges, which are sort of secret brotherhoods, where the seeds of chaos are first planted. And anyways, Horus falls to chaos. And again, chaos in this case means the chaos gods, who are literally gods. They have godlike power, godlike nature. They desire worship. They're worshipped by billions or trillions. They're millions of years old, perhaps, and their power is just unfathomable, and they're completely evil, completely and totally evil by any standard we would understand. So they're basically 4 different Satans. And basically a certain number of the Space Marine Primarchs are corrupted to the worship of these satanic beings, and then they launch what's called the Horus Heresy, where they basically try to use a sneak attack to attack the God Emperor himself in the throne of Terra, on the planet Terra, and they massacre their way across the universe, brutal slaughter of innocent people and atrocities and horrible, horrible, evil shit, with literal demons and shit, by the way, helping them, because these are the actual forces of hell. And they finally get to Terra, but the God Emperor can't do anything because he's sitting on the Golden Throne. And if he gets off the Golden Throne, the Astronomicon will go out. And if the Astronomicon goes out, that will be disastrous. But he has a friend named Malkador the Sigillite. And Malkador the Sigillite is the most powerful psychic of all time, other than the God Emperor himself. And he sits on the throne. That's why they call him Malkador the Hero. because it's continuous torture for him to have to sit on the throne. And he does this long enough for the God Emperor to teleport aboard the battle barge Eye of something, Vengeance, which is Horus's flagship. And then the God Emperor confronts Horus, but the God Emperor's favored child, Sanguinus, the Blood Angel Primarch, tries to fight Horus, maybe wounds him, but is himself killed. And then the God Emperor fights Horus, and the God Emperor himself is fatally wounded, basically split from like hip to chest, huge cut, like ripped in half almost, like upwards. But he kills Horus, and not only that, destroys his soul completely, like annihilates him from existence. Then they have to inter him on the Golden Throne as a life support device to keep him alive. And he has had, since then, they now call him the Corpse Emperor, because he's had to exist on this Golden Throne for 10,000 years in a state of continuous agony, sustained basically only by his superhuman will and immortal nature. But he's essentially a living corpse who's constantly suffering. So he's kind of like Jesus Christ being like crucified forever for like 10,000 years. But he can't even speak anymore or move, but he still keeps the Golden Throne functioning. He still does the Astronomicon, so trade and travel and communication can happen. And he simultaneously keeps all four Chaos Gods out of real space because his spiritual will is strong enough to hold the warp shut, basically, is what that comes down to. And anyways, if anyone has like particular questions or things they would like me to talk about, there's like literally no end to this, but that's sort of like a basic introduction without even talking about any of the other like Xenos races, the other alien empires and so forth. But that brings you up.
Maybe you could talk about, you talked about his 20 sons. The God Emperor's 20 sons was something that started off the lore and was a big part. Maybe you could talk about what happens to them and where they go out throughout the universe, since it's such a key part of it.
Well, sure. So each of them are the head of what's originally called a legion, but after the Horus Heresy, the legions are divided into what are called chapters, and each Primarch is the leader of his own legion, and they basically look at the Primarch as like a father and almost like a god. They're all loyal to the Emperor, but their Primarch to them is like their father, and like they literally are demigods, these characters. Like they're like incredibly supernaturally powerful. And each of them have completely different personalities and completely different backgrounds and histories. And ultimately, half of them end up falling to chaos and half of them remain loyal, which is why the Horus Heresy is actually a 50-50 split, where half of the Space Marine legions follow Horus and try and betray the Emperor, and half of them remain loyal. You could talk about their different personalities or their different characteristics. But again, there's a lot of them, so
maybe just like what is important that happens to them, like the important things that they influence in the lore, obviously.
Right. Well, I mean, Horus is the big one because he's the one who betrays the Emperor and leads the Horus Heresy, wounds the Emperor, and basically destroys the future of mankind, because by wounding the Emperor the way that he did, he ruined the whole plan of the Great Crusade, right? The Emperor was supposed to be able to actively lead the Empire, and now he can't do that because he's been fatally wounded by Horus. So that's the big one. Lorgar Aurelian created basically what's called the Imperial Creed, which is actually, ironically, the religion that they follow now, which is based on worshiping the Emperor, which they should do. But the point is, he himself created like a chaotic religion and spread the religion of chaos. Marnius Calgar is, in a way, the greatest of the Primarchs. He's the greatest administrator. He's like a tactical genius, an administrative and managerial genius. And he's particularly important because he's actually come back into the present timeline, the first of the Primarchs to do so. They've all been lost for a long time or confirmed dead. But he came back to life. He was in stasis, and he's returned. He's now the Lord Governor of the entire empire. So he now rules essentially in the stead of the God Emperor, because the God Emperor can only speak psychically and only does so to very rare people. But he did speak to Rubaut Guilliman, and so one thing we know from that is that he's actually becoming more powerful. So even though he appears to be dying, he's actually growing stronger year by year as he absorbs thousands and thousands of psychic souls. He's basically eating eating the God Emperor is consuming thousands of psychic humans plus like millions of regular souls every day, and just growing in power constantly as a result of that.
Crazy. So I
Hey.
guess then what?
Oh.
No, go ahead, Jerish.
I was gonna say, in the many threats that there exist in the Empire, other than chaos, I think the Tyranids are one of the most fun to just kind of set the scope because they're kind of a threat to everyone. So have at it with the Tyranids. Go there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you bring that up because chaos is called the archenemy to the extent that it gets focused on for good reason. Because if chaos wins, we all literally go to hell and get tortured forever. But other than chaos, the greatest threat is the Tyranids, and arguably the Tyranids are an even greater threat. And the Tyranids are a biological super predator who have learned to travel between the stars and between planets, and their sole purpose is to consume all biomass, digest that biomass, and then process that genetic material so as to super speed their own genetic evolution. So everything they eat, they digest, they understand, they incorporate it, they continue, they evolve, they hunt, they eat, they consume, they evolve, they hunt, they eat, they consume. And they may have consumed entire galaxies before, for all we know. And they're now beginning to arrive at the Milky Way. And nobody knows the ultimate strength of the hive fleets, but even the tendrils that they have so far run into, like Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan, basically, took everything the Empire had just to survive. And like the entire chapter of the Ultramarines, First Company sacrificed themselves, Battle of Macragge, etc. And yeah, so it's very unclear how and if the Empire can survive the Tyranid menace either. And that's all as the Cicatrix Maledictum is a galaxy-spanning warp rift that is now opened in the modern timeline. So it's the darkest of all times right now, except for the fact that the Primarchs are coming back, and the Empire appears to be sort of coming back awake and becoming active again.
Whoa, what was that rift that you were talking about? The breach in space-time?
Yeah, so if you go back to the pictures that I posted before, I'll post them again in general chat if I can. For some reason, there's not letting me do that. But yeah, I don't know why it won't let me post an image. But anyway, there's something called the Cadian Gate. And the Cadian Gate is an Imperial-controlled planet called Cadia, located at the entrance of the Eye of Terror. And the Eye of Terror is a permanent warp rift. In other words, an area where the hell space, the DMT hell space of the warp, overlapped and coexist with real space, right? So it's like a hell rift that's perpetually open, where hell and real space are overlapped and coexisting. So the Cadian Gate is an Imperial planet that's called a fortress world, which means every single man, woman, and child is a trained armed soldier constantly in the military, 100% military membership. The whole planet is a fortress. It's surrounded by orbital defenses, whole fleets of battleships, right? Because after the Horus Heresy, when Horus was killed by the Emperor, that triggered a period of time called the Great Scouring. The Great Scouring was when basically Imperial forces pursued all of the traitors throughout the galaxy, killing them and exterminating them and punishing and bringing them to justice. And so in order to escape Imperial justice, the traitor forces fled into the Eye of Terror. And ever since then, that's been their base of operations from which they periodically launch assaults on Imperial space, which are called Black Crusades. And currently there's been 13 Black Crusades, all of them led by Abaddon, who is the inheritor of Horus. They call him Abaddon the Despoiler, only person who bears the mark of chaos undivided other than Horus himself, who is now dead and destroyed. And so in the 13th Black Crusade, Cadia actually fell, and Cadia was destroyed. And so that thing where they say, let it be known that the planet failed before the guard did, meaning they fought so long the planet itself broke apart, but they never gave up. However, because Cadia contained a series of psychoactive pylons whose purpose appears to have been to sort of ground and dissipate warp energy, that apparently was very bad. So when those pylons were destroyed, when Abaddon took a black stone fortress, which is like a huge orbital fortress, and he literally threw it into Cadia just to destroy the planet that way, it literally ripped the whole galaxy in half. So there's now like a hell rift from one side of the galaxy to the other, which is why they now call it the Imperium Nihilus, or the Dark Imperium, because over half of the galaxy technically can no longer see the light of the Astronomicon if they're in the wrong place in relation to what's called the Cicatrix Maledictum, which is this galaxy-spanning rip of warp space. So it's like an unbelievably bad situation that should, by all accounts, be, totally unsurvivable by humanity. But we'll see.
Well, yeah, that's crazy. You're doing a fantastic job at like giving the narrative and explaining the lore well enough to understand. Juris, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I'm saying you can either take this forward or you can take it back. And if you want to go back, Necrons and Orcs. And if you want to go forward, maybe Tau. Or if you really want to go, you should actually, touch on the Tyranids. You should talk about the Gene Stealer cultists and that faction of the Tyranids. That's some twisted stuff.
Yeah, 100% I will. Good idea. Just grabbing something here. So the Tyranids are highly advanced biological species, and one of the ways in which that they propagate is the Gene Stealer cults, who basically are like advanced vanguards who arrive on planets before the main bulk or whatever of the Tyranid hive fleets, and they originally, thank you very much, they originally are identical to humans, basically, with small variations. And they infiltrate, and they're basically just human. They look like humans, but they're not. And so they're subverting the society and actually encouraging the worship of the hive fleets. So that by the time they come, this populace itself will revolt against the government, and there'll be civil war, and then it'll be even more impossible to fight the actual Tyranid swarms when they come, because these crazy Gene Stealer cults have been subverting society for however many years, while broadcasting a signal to the hive mind, and the hive mind is like a galactic intelligence. The individual Tyranids are conduits or synapse creatures, and each of them have what you might call individual consciousness, but in reality they are only synapses. And so whatever consciousness they have is only like a fractal portion of the hive mind itself. But that mind as a whole is like a galactic mind of just like unfathomable power, which is why they call it the shadow and the warp, because when the hive mind approaches, its mental power is so great it like blocks out all lesser psychics, and like they can't like send signals to each other, and it like blinds them basically, because it's like a whale has gone over and just like blocked all the sunlight, and that's how you know you're fucked basically, because it's already too late to call for help.
Do you want to talk about what psychics, like what it's like to be a psychic in Warhammer 40K? And what their abilities are and what they connect to? Do they connect to this DMT hellscape realm they used to travel through space, or is it another psychic dimension?
Yeah, good question. So all psychers draw on the power called the warp. All species, for the most part, have psychers. There's only a few exceptions, if any, actually. So to be a psyker means you've begun to evolve psychic powers. Some, like the Eldar, have very powerful psychic abilities. The humans are also quite powerful psychers, those who have it. But it's not like a lot of humans have no psychic powers, only a small percentage have any. And then of those who have any, their power ranges from insignificant to like godlike. And there's a whole scale for this, right? So there's an alpha level psyker could like, I don't know, potentially like turn a sun out or some crazy shit like that. A beta level psyker could like, melt 100 tanks into like liquid at one time. A theta level psyker could fly. Like there's like a whole sliding scale, right? And obviously the more powerful psychers are rarer. And what you can actually do with your psychic power is basically unlimited. There's two things to consider, though. Are you doing psychic powers or are you doing sorcery? Because any psychic at any time can sell their soul to Zenich. Zenich being the chaos god who rules both ambition and magic and psychic sorcery. So it's a constant temptation to any psyker to make a pact with Zenich because their powers will then be instantly magnified like 100-fold as Zenich teaches them all the magic that he knows, right? But they'll lose their soul in the bargain. But if they do, they become sorcerers, and then they have drastically greater powers. But if they're loyal, because the Emperor does permit psychers in his armies, there's imperially sanctioned psychers, then their powers are more limited, like shooting bolts of lightning out of their hands, creating a sword of lightning. Like, there's all kinds of crazy shit they can do, but it's not as unlimited as sorcery. And even then, it poses a risk to their soul, because anytime you use psychic powers, you are tempting damnation, which is why only like the strongest and most carefully trained people are allowed to do it. And the vast majority of psychers fail these tests and are therefore actually fed to the Emperor as basically human sacrifices. So the inquisitorial black ships go from planet to planet, and they collect all the psychers, no matter how great or small, children, adults, like healers, witches, whatever you are, astrologers. They test them all, and then a very small number are given roles with like the Inquisition, the Space Marines, or whatever, and the rest of them are put in the Astronomicon in astropathic choirs, and they're just like wired up to the Golden Throne, and they basically just sing prayers to the Emperor, and they add their soul's light to his, and he just kind of like sucks them dry like batteries. So most psychers just get fed to the Emperor. Those who don't could be anywhere from like an Imperial Guard psyker who can shoot lightning out of his hands or like predict the future, to like a Space Marine librarian who, you know, would have very, very powerful psychic abilities.
Do you want to talk about what it's like sorcerer, what actually do sell their soul? And it's funny you say that, because now I'm remembering a scene in one of those like animations you showed me where there was a psychic doing some power, and then they got taken over, and like some people in the armor just killed him immediately. So I mean, I'm pretty sure that is what happened. But what happens when they do that successfully and they become an actual sorcerer?
Well, it would depend, right? So any psychic could use various methods to essentially contact either Zinch himself or some demon of Zinch, more likely. And then they can make a pact. You can make an agreement. And the details of that agreement would vary based on the demon and what you agreed. But as soon as you make any pact with chaos, your soul is now essentially irredeemably damned. And you begin suffering mutations. But, so say I was a wizard. I could say, Zenich, I'll serve you, but, you know, give me magical power. And then all of a sudden, my spells will go from, you know, level 1 to level 10, so to speak. But I'll start growing feathers, and my pupils will turn into like hourglass shapes, and I'll start growing a beak and shit. And I'll become a slave of chaos.
Crazy.
And those are just examples, and they happen slowly. But chaos always mutates you. So once you be marked by chaos, they call it gifts, right? You'll grow like extra eyes, fangs, long ears, weird, anything could happen basically. Chaos is chaos, so it always changes everything.
So I think we're dancing around chaos a little bit in this lore discussion. Would you like to delve deeper on into what chaos is and the factions that rule it and its principles, its gods, and what happens with it?
Well, yeah. And that's the hardest thing to explain in a way. So again, chaos is called the Empyrean or the warp, and all these terms are used interchangeably. But technically, the realm of chaos only refers to the parts of the warp that are the territories of the four great chaos gods, Nurgle, Zenich, Slaanesh, and Khorne. And each of those regions have characteristics and inhabitants that are representative of that particular god. So Khorne sits on a gigantic brass throne on a heap of skulls, right? They say blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. So he literally sits there on top of like millions upon millions of skulls on this huge brass throne and watches all these demons fight and kill each other all the time, because that's just his thing. If you go to Slanish's domain, it is like it would be the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, in like a freaky way. Like the grass would be like velvet pillows, the trees would be like beautiful and like have like beautiful eyes and be like moaning and shivering and have like beautiful fruits on them that smelled like incense, and like there'd be like beautiful naked creatures cavorting around. And you go into it and basically just encounter deeper and deeper temptations and seductions and perversions until you would ultimately lose your soul in Slanesh's gardens. Nurgle, well, he rules over what's called Nurgle's garden, because although he's a god of decay, decay is also life. And so he represents the fecundity of putrefaction. So he rules over like a garden he considers very beautiful, but we would find it absolutely horrible, right? We'd rotten mushrooms with mold and mildew and fungus and spores and slime and snails and slugs and bugs. But that's basically what his kingdom is like. And finally, Zenech rules over an ever-changing crystal labyrinth castle that would be kind of like a library combined with a glass castle if you're on DMT, if it was a labyrinth. And that's basically what that's kind of like. And those are the four realms of chaos, and the four gods of chaos are forever engaged in what they call the Great Game, which is their eternal struggle for dominance within the warp, and they only periodically stop to pay attention to real space and attack real space. And yet even so, they've almost destroyed real space multiple times, and if they ever got their shit together and worked together, they would destroy real space, but it's impossible by the nature of chaos for that ever to happen, basically. They can't work together in that way, except when unified by Abaddon for the Black Crusades.
Druish, do you have a question that you could ask relating to chaos, maybe, to keep us on that subject for a little bit, if you're there? If not, that's all right. So,
go ahead.
I'm wondering, the warp that spans across the universe that opens up to this DMT hellscape, are there like beings that are like coming through that constantly? Is it an active war zone on that barrier at all times?
Well, yes, because that's the whole problem with warp rifts, is that warp rifts are literally breaches of the warp realm, which we might as well call DMT hell, into real space. So anytime there's a warp rift, that's like the worst possible problem, because for example, let's say you were on Earth right now and all of a sudden a warp rift opened and it happened to consume your planet, which could happen on any of the millions of planets in Imperial space at any time, right? All of a sudden the sky, all the clouds would turn into demonic leering faces, like glaring at you. Things would just light on like rainbow colored fire. Trees would start screaming. Tentacles would come out of the ground and wrap around your legs and start raping you. Your skull would explode, but you wouldn't die, and then it would just go on and on like that. That's basically what like a warp rift would be like. Like demons would be flooding through the streets, just like cutting everyone's heads off. It'd just be completely crazy, right? So for that to have happened from like one side, now it doesn't mean that it's a continuous assault. It means that there's an opening, though, for chaos to strike at any part of the empire at any time. Whereas in the past, they were contained at the Eye of Terror, which is why the Cadian Gate was so strategically important, because we knew as long as we could defeat chaos at the Cadian Gate, we could prevent them from rampaging through the universe the way they did during the Horus Heresy. Well, now they can attack right all the way to Terra again. So.
Huh. So, is there an active war to close this rift, or you said it's pretty much hopeless? Is there like is there a way that could be closed and fixed?
Presumably, yes, and it's not hopeless for one thing, because again, Rabot Guilliman returned, and you can't downplay how important this is, because the Imperium's problem and the reason it's been in a state of decay is because the God Emperor has not been able to play an active role in the administration and governance of his empire, because he's been fatally wounded and he's sitting in the golden throne in a state of, psychic agony, just holding the universe together with his mind, right? And so therefore the empire is corrupt because it's humans, the high lords of Terra, making these decisions. Well, now we're about Guilliman, who is again arguably the emperor's favored son, and if not the emperor's favored son, probably the emperor's best son, and certainly the emperor's best administrator son, is now serving as the High Lord of Terra, which means now the whole empire is unified under a Primarch who's basically a demigod. And so he's already taken stock, spoken to his father, they've made a plan together, and they launched what's called the Indominus Crusade, which is why they call it now, imperially, they call it the Era Indominus. And in that period of time, Robout Guilliman with the Adeptus Custodes, the Adeptus Sororitas, the Adeptus Astartes, and the Adeptus Militarum, which are the different divisions, and Adeptus Mechanicum of the Imperial Military, they have gone on like a massive ass-kicking crusade and basically sort of bailed out all the planets that were under attack, cleansed demons of a huge part of space, and basically kind of not in any way solved the problem, but got the upper hand back, so to speak. And the big thing now is that there's every reason to think that at least 2 more Primarchs are probably going to come back soon. And it only takes a few Primarchs to change like everything. And that's also not talking about the Tau, who are an emerging new alien species that's very powerful and very progressive, who are also doing a good job. And also, well, there's so much, but I just need a break for a sec. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's wild. Do you want to talk about the Tau, and go into some other maybe races that inhabit the universe?
Yeah. So the Tau are a relatively young species. They are similar in stature to humans, although somewhat smaller on average. Their skin is blue. They have flat facial features, and they have an Asian cultural aesthetic. And their unifying culture is communist in nature, and it's based on what's called the greater good. So their whole philosophy is based on being parts of a greater system, which is to the greater good, and they each are part of a caste. So there's the air caste, the water caste, the fire caste, and the earth caste. So the earth caste grows the food, the air caste are the pilots, the fire caste are the warriors, the water caste are the diplomats, and then the spirit caste are called the ethereals, and they possess some kind of unknown power, which is probably psychic in nature, but nobody really knows, which allows them to basically enforce like total unity among other Tau. So like all Tau are completely like loyal and work together as one because of this quality that the ethereals have. And we're not sure how that works, but obviously that's extremely useful. And also they are not soulless, but they have no superstition and no real involvement in the warp, which means that they are largely immune to corruption by chaos so far. As of yet, chaos doesn't really pay much attention to the Tau, which is another big advantage. And they have a non-warp based system of flight, which again means they're not at risk of the warp, although it does mean they're much slower. But their technology is highly advanced. Their weaponry is highly advanced.
They can be more powerful psychics if they're less if they're less inhibited by chaos.
Well, no, it's because they have psychic abilities whatsoever that they're safe from chaos corruption. Basically, they are psychic blanks. They don't have any psychic powers, but that's a good thing because psychic powers are what opens you up to corruption by chaos. It's a double-edged sword. But the one thing the Tau do not have are psychers. The only thing that they do have are the ethereals, and again, we don't know how their power works, but all it does is creates total uniformity of will among all Tau as long as one ethereal is present. So as long as an ethereal is present, they all work as one.
So I guess if none of them are getting taken over by chaos, that allows them to have that complete unified aspect of their society, and then there's never any single one that gets taken over by chaos and works against the group. Is that another major factor in why they're so cooperative and able to work together like that? Also, not using the warp drive, so they never encountered the DMT like hell.
Well, so far, as far as I know, there's no evidence of any Tau that's been corrupted by chaos, which is crazy because all sentient beings can be corrupted by chaos. But as far as I know, no Tau has been as of yet, although it may happen eventually. But you have to remember the Tau, although they're powerful and expanding, they represent a very small and young empire. So they're like a dynamic and expanding power, but they're minuscule in power compared to like the human empire, etc. Because they only occupy a relatively small part of the eastern part of space.
So, okay. It seems like we've walked ourselves pretty much to the end. Do you want to walk us through maybe some very important event in Warhammer history that's now just long past?
A very important event in Warhammer history that's long past. Well, I mean,
Like, I'm thinking if there was events that like inspired religions and like changed whole events of societies and things like that because of these single, arcs, things that are very important in the lore.
well, one thing is that the Emperor we call him the God Emperor, and he is indeed the God Emperor of mankind. But the thing is, he actually created a secular religion based on scientific, humanistic, materialistic, logical values. And what he created in his own living time was called the Imperial Creed. And the Imperial Creed was no superstition, no religion, no gods, no churches, no worship. Everything is science, logic. It was like Star Trek type, like rationality and benevolent, like human scientific technocracy. That was what the God Emperor actually envisioned, which ironically was his downfall and his failing and his mistake. And the great transition that happened was after he was wounded by Horus, the Imperial Creed, ironically created by Lurgar Aurelian, one of his greater Primarchs, became the official religion of the Imperium. And so he was transformed into, the God Emperor of mankind, as he truly is. But he never wanted that, unless it was some kind of double psyop. But the point is, originally it was like a scientific atheist Imperium, and then it became like a hardcore like theocracy. And that was basically a consequence of the Horus heresy. But ironically, the Emperor was totally wrong, because in a world where the warp exists, the strongest power is faith. And the faith of trillions of people in the God Emperor is incredibly powerful. And it protects both him and his citizens against the most evil forces. So the counter, like the banishing, the exorcist, you can hold their cross up and the vampire recoils from the cross. That's real in Warhammer, because if you have real faith, that actually affects the warp. So if you're like a really powerfully faithful person, you could manifest miracles. You could be protected by demons. You could even banish demons. So in the end, the Emperor's dream, which was well-intentioned, to create like a secular, scientific, enlightened culture, was like a mistake. And in the end, he created like a theocracy, which is the only thing that protects us from literally the devil.
So you said there's the God Emperor is a literal god and his sons are demigods. What is the religious, I guess not even religious, but the theocratical aspect of this universe, and what are the spiritual implications of that? Because clearly there's the DMT realm, there's the psychics. Are the psychics relating to the same religious realm that the gods work with, and what's their actual abilities like?
The gods? Or who?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, the gods' abilities.
So a few things to understand. There's multiple pantheons. The gods are real, first of all. Gods are real. They're not just like cultural concepts. They're not just like in people's minds. They're real beings, and they're very, very powerful. Now, an ancient pantheon was the Eldar pantheon. The Eldar pantheon had many gods, like a Roman pantheon or a Greek pantheon. There were many Eldar gods. Tragically, very tragically, almost all of those were destroyed by Slaanesh after Slaanesh was born out of the depravity and the atrocities of the Eldar race. So before Slaanesh, there was a pantheon of like nature gods and gods of art and gods of beauty and gods of healing. All of those basically were destroyed and consumed by Slaanesh when Slaanesh was born. The ones that are still alive are Sigorak, the laughing god, also known as Segarash. I should say Sigorak, the laughing god, the god of the Harlequins. He's still alive. Cain still exists, the god of war. The Eldar god of war still exists in his own way, although he's fractured into multiple fragments of himself. Also, Aisha, the goddess of healing, still exists, but she's just entrapped by Nurgle and basically constantly fed horrible poison every day. But she can heal herself, so she's basically being tortured. And so those gods exist. There's also a god named Yniad, the Eldar god of the dead. He is not yet awake, he's nascent, and he is forming in the infinity circuits of the Eldar craft worlds. So Eldar craft worlds are planet-sized Eldar spaceships, and Path World or Craft World Eldar escaped the catastrophe that wiped out the Eldar because they had gotten on these, they saw what was coming, because they're farseers, they're psychic, they saw what was coming. So they made these planet-sized spaceships, and they got as far away as possible from the Eldar culture, and then the Eldar culture got ripped open when Slaanesh was born, so they survived. They have what are called soul stones, because every Eldar's soul is claimed by Slaanesh. So as soon as an Eldar dies, Slaanesh takes their souls and tortures it for all time, basically, in like a literal hell, sadistic like BDSM sex hell. And so in order to avoid that, they wear soul stones that trap their soul when they die, and then they attach the souls into what they call the Infinity Matrix, and they all live together in like a Gestalt consciousness on board their craft worlds. But as they add more and more souls, and more Eldar die and join, their collective consciousness is awakening into one Gestalt god named Yniad. So eventually all the dead Eldar will be reborn as the Eldar god of the dead, Yniad, and he's only just begun to wake up. The God Emperor himself is a god, because although if you were to see him in real life, you would only see his rotten corpse. If you had witch sight, he would be like blinding like 10,000 suns, and his power would be so big it would like occupy a huge part of the Milky Way galaxy. And he's so powerful that he's essentially fighting and winning an arm wrestle with 4 enemy gods simultaneously at all times, while battling all these other things. So his power is just like, you know, to call him a god is just, there's no other real way to describe it, even though he himself denies that he's a god.
Why does he deny he's a god?
Why does he deny that he's a god? It's a good question. I mean, he was preaching a vision of like progress and advancement for humanity, and like a utopian vision where humanity would rule as the like, you know, overlords of space. He didn't want to be worshipped as a god, but in the end he was. So
how do the gods relate to the civilians of the planets and the people? Are there like, I guess, are there demigods on the planets that are figureheads for them, or is it faith-based, relating through religion? Do they gain power and like give out power to the people who follow them?
So the Chaos gods do, right? This is why so many people sell their souls to Chaos, because the Chaos gods give rewards. They give temptations, they make pacts and agreements, and they reward your acts, right? So anything as simple as killing your own baby, God forbid, on a sacrifice, or killing your family, Khorne would be pleased by that, right? He would be pleased. If you just butchered 10 people, Khorne would be pleased by that. And if you continue to just butcher people and rampantly slaughter people, and you got away with it, and you continued to kill more people, and you did this in the name of Khorne, he would pay more and more attention to you. So basically, you'd be getting his eye on you. And once the eye of a Chaos God is in you, he starts changing you. So you might start growing claws, you might start growing fangs, you might get red eyes, right? And you start mutating into this creature that more and more reflects your new evil, corrupt nature. And as you continue to do more and more depraved acts, your power might continue to grow, but many of your mutations will actually be maladaptive, and many, if not most, will devolve into chaos spawn. You'll literally just turn into some like disgusting, like rancid monster, like screaming. But a small number of you who has the greatest success will become what's called a chaos champion. And chaos champions who do like truly incredible things in the name of their gods, like destroy whole planets or sacrifice like billions of souls, can actually ascend to demonhood, in which case they become like lesser chaos gods themselves, who are technically immortal and then have their own kingdom in the warp as well as like lesser daemons. But that would be like 0.0001%, whereas every other follower of chaos will literally just be like tortured or consumed by the gods that they worship.
So then, what do the gods that aren't of chaos? They don't give rewards at all. Do they interact at all with anyone?
Yes. So Sigorak, when a Harlequin, so there's different kinds of Eldar that still exist, right? So the Dark Eldar live in Komorra, which is the Dark City. And the most disturbing of all the disturbing parts of Warhammer 40,000 is Komorra. So I'm not going to go too deep into the details of it, but just imagine like the most like horrendous torture, BDSM torture you can possibly imagine in this like evil, sunless, like satanic city of like torturous BDSM freaks. That's basically what Komorra is, and they bring slaves there all the time and they torture them and whatever. So they are basically staving off what they call She Who Thirsts. So She Who Thirsts is Slaanesh, and Slaanesh has already claimed all of their souls. So she's slowly bleeding their souls dry, and they're suffering and they're dying, and they can only stave it off by making other beings suffer. So the Dark Eldar solution to this is to torture other conscious beings, and by doing so, they can buy time, basically, and that's the only way they can survive. The Eldar don't have to do this. They live on either far-flung planets. They're called Exodites. They live on like paradise worlds, and they actually bind with like the world spirit of that planet. So when they die, instead of being eaten by Slaanesh, they go into that planet's like world soul. And the Path World Eldar follow disciplined paths, which prevent them from being corrupted by Slaanesh, blah, blah, blah. But what was my point about all this? There was something important about...
I asked what the
You talk about the Harlequins and the Laughing God.
Oh, that's right. So all souls are claimed by Slaanesh, all Eldar souls. The Harlequins are, among other things, troubadours. Like they are like masterful dancers and acrobats and clowns and performers, basically. And they go through the webway and they perform at all these different craft worlds. And what they actually do is they reenact the epic fall of the Eldar. They reenact the tragic story of the birth of Slaanesh. Now, in order for this to happen, one of them actually has to play the role of Slaanesh. But to play the role of Slaanesh is to court damnation, right? This creates like such a powerful temptation or corruption in the Eldar soul to actually do this, that this puts them at risk of damnation. Now, every mask, when they die, basically Sigorak battles Slaanesh for their soul. And in most cases, Sigorak actually triumphs and saves the soul of the mask or the Harlequin from Slaanesh. So that's just one example of an Eldar god who saves his followers from the predations of Slaanesh. If you're a human, you actually have good hope. All you have to do is be faithful and serve the Emperor, no matter how humble your station. As long as you remain loyal to the Emperor, and as long as you do your duty unto death, and as long as you have faith in the Emperor, you will be taken into his light, right? Because he's like this huge light in the warp. Now, if you didn't have the protection of the Emperor, as soon as you died, your soul would appear like you'd be like a person appearing in the middle of a shark-infested ocean, and you just rapidly be eaten by one of the many warp entities that are just like demons and monsters everywhere, right? So when you died, you would appear, your spiritual being would still exist, but there'd be these like horrible, like Lovecraftian creatures everywhere that would eat you. So unless you're like some unbelievably powerful creature yourself, like perhaps a Primarch or some kind of powerful sorcerer, your only chance of survival is to be loyal to the Emperor, in which case you can be, if he judges you worthy, take it into his light, which is sort of like heaven, as far as you might say. You'll be protected and saved there in the Emperor's light, and you'll become part of him, sort of. Or you've dedicated yourself to one of the forces of chaos. Then your fate depends on how successful you were as a servant of that chaos god. If you were incredibly successful, you may actually be rewarded, but 99% of the time you're just going to be put through, nightmarish tortures. Even if you spend your whole life serving this chaos god, they're just going to look at you as a failure. They don't have any compassion at all for their followers unless it amuses them to.
Okay. Do you want to talk about how the Gate of Imperium fell?
Well, the Cadian Gate fell in the 13th
yeah.
Black Crusade. And again, there was a huge hellacious war. Usarker Creed was like a great imperial general who was leading the defense. The Cadians never break. They're the best soldiers in the empire. But there's these things called the Blackstone fortresses, and nobody actually really knows who made the Blackstone fortresses. They're pre-human technology, but they're huge, fortresses like star forts. And somehow Abaddon got a hold of one. I don't remember how. And he literally just plowed it into Cadia, like he just threw it like an asteroid into the planet, and it was so big it just cracked the planet in half and destroyed everything.
Okay, I guess I didn't quite follow that was that event.
There was a lot more like fighting and war that happened before that point, but that was when Cadia finally was destroyed. That's why they say, let it be known that the planet was destroyed before the Guard was, because they were still fighting when the planet was like blown up.
So after the planet blew up, what became the main focus of the war efforts then? The actual rift?
Well, most planets would be fighting wars of survival because they would be under attack by demons or by perhaps aliens, and so many planets would be separated, and they would be fighting, their planetary defense forces would be fighting just to survive. However, the Indominus Crusade, led by Marnius Calgar, Rebel Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, is, going around reunifying all these, reestablishing order, basically. So right now there's a huge crusade, one of the biggest in history, that's, successfully restoring order and saving planets and all that. But many, many planets are just fighting for their lives or are completely lost, basically.
So when these planets cross over, are there large crossover events in the lore of races meeting and like say becoming partners or like breaking up relationships and things like that?
Well, that certain races can work together, like the Tau will incorporate many different alien species into their empire, including humans. Anybody who's willing to work for the greater good can be part of the Tau. However, the humans have a strict policy of xenocide, which means that they basically just exterminate any other intelligent human and non-human species on principle, basically. There's not many exceptions to that. But humans will kill basically any other intelligent alien as like a matter of their faith, basically.
And how do the rest of the universe feel about that?
Well, they fight back, obviously, but the might of the empire, although it's on its like dire straits and it's facing all these existential threats, is still by far the greatest and most powerful military force in the universe, or that the universe has ever known, as far as we know, other than things in long lost history. It's impossible to like overestimate how powerful that humanity actually is, despite the fact that they're definitely facing existential threats. So they're capable of fighting multiple wars on multiple fronts, and in fact, they're fighting wars on like every front. They're fighting thousands of wars.
Yeah, well, isn't the saying in a distant future, like what is it, in a distant future, glim, but nothing but war?
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.
Does that stand true through the whole series?
The laughing of thirsting gods. Yeah. Well, there is actual paradise planets. There are planets that are well administered. There are peaceful planets. There are trillions of humans living happy lives. But if you actually understand the threats and the perils facing humanity, it literally drives people insane, which is why the Inquisition includes like the Ordo Malleus and the Ordo Hereticus, not only to fight chaos, but to make sure people never know it even exists. Because as soon as the thought even enters people's mind, it just starts infecting their brains and infecting everything. So, and like the Dark Eldar and the shit that they do, like if people knew, they'd just be terrified all the time. And like they have to deal with enemies that are literally demonic and superhuman in nature, and like it's pretty crazy. And yet they've been able to do it for 10,000 years and successfully. So it's pretty crazy.
Keeping it under wraps from all of these different societies? Is that for the reason that if they did know and fell to chaos, it would be immensely more powerful?
Well, it's because imagine what would happen just think of Earth, right? Like the humans that live on Earth, what kind of people are on this planet. What if people knew that there was 4 gods that you could literally sell your soul to, who would literally reward you in different ways, including sex, pleasure, power, wealth, success, right? So if you wanted to be the CEO of a company, you could literally sell your soul to Zenich and he would make you the CEO of that company, but now he's got your soul. Or if you wanted to be, the next like UFC champion, you could sell your soul to Korn and he's going to make you stronger or whatever. But, in other words, if you want to have sex, you sell your soul to Slaanesh. Imagine how quickly this society would just become corrupted because of the simple fact that people knew that was even an option, right?
Yeah.
Like, they can't be allowed to know that these beings even exist because the way people are, dumb like kids go in the graveyard and play with Ouija boards, and people literally try and summon the devil just for shits and giggles. So in a world where that's actually possible, you can't even let them think about it.
So do people, I guess, are there factions that will use that to their advantage, like have one person sell their soul for a certain like strategical advantage?
Yes. So the Inquisition is the organization, one of the organizations created by Malcador the Sigillite after the Horus Heresy. He created the Officio Assassinorum, which is the various guilds of assassins, because they said, wow, this Horus guy really caused a lot of shit. We need to be able to kill people whenever we need to. So he created the Assassins Guild, the different schools of death that are for assassination. He also created the Inquisition, which was to counter the forces of chaos. And the Inquisition has 3 branches: the Ordo Xenos, which fights the threat without, meaning the aliens; the Ordo Malleus, which is the threat beyond, which is the demonic and chaos threat; and the Ordo Hereticus, which is the threat within, meaning corruption and apostasy and heresy. And so there's 3 organizations, all of whom are called the Inquisition: Malleus, Hereticus, and Xenos. And they actually have unlimited authority and unlimited power. So by carrying the Inquisitorial Rosette, they have power over everyone except for the Emperor and his personal bodyguards. So they could order a planet destroyed, they could requisition every spaceship in a sector of space, they could take control of any army, execute any governor. They have absolute power, basically.
Holy shit. So what's more powerful than them selling their soul to do that, or a psychic who is like at the max power level?
Well, by the way, these Inquisitor guys aren't selling their soul. These guys are loyal. That's power they have as a result of being loyal servants of the Emperor. However, what I meant to say is within the circle of Inquisitors, there's various schools of thought, including what are called radical Inquisitors. And so radical Inquisitors believe in using the forces of chaos against it, right? They say, well, we have to understand it, so we have to study it. So 2 different kinds of Inquisitor, right? You have a Puritan. There's multiple, but say you have the Puritan and the Radical. They both find a book like the Necronomicon full of like black magic spells. The Puritan is immediately going to cover it in holy water and incinerate it with like a flamethrower, right? He's going to be like, this thing is evil. It must be destroyed. The Radical is going to be like, we need to read it. We need to understand it. We need to know what it says and like how to use it against itself and blah, blah, blah. And so there's radical Inquisitors, but that really is heresy and basically just always leads to the corruption of the Inquisitor. But there are Inquisitors who, are radical. meaning anything from using forbidden alien technology, forbidden artificial intelligence, to, you know, actually using sorcery and binding demons yourself. Technically, an Inquisitor can do any of that, but any other Inquisitor finding out about it is going to probably persecute him. But it does happen.
I see.
Yeah.
So
And
where does that leave us?
where does it leave us in the timeline, in the story?
Yeah.
Well, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times, is the Shakespeare line. With the Cicatrix Maledictum and half of the Empire being cut off from the Empire's light, that's pretty grim. But the fact that the Primarchs are actually returning and coming back to life has sort of unlimited positive potential. There's also something called the Terminus Decree, which is a secret edict that the Emperor left, where he said, when it looks like all hope is lost, you know, open this seal and read the Terminus Decree. So he has some kind of weird plan. And it can also be mentioned that there's something called Primaris Space Marines, and a guy called Belisarius Call, who is a Archmagos of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and he created basically super Space Marines, thousands of them, as well as he's actually progressing human technology again after it being decaying for a long time. So all of those things are positive things, and the awakening of Yin-Yad has a lot of potential. But again, my personal theory is that what's going to happen is eventually the Emperor is going to give up the ghost. When he gives up the ghost, his soul will no longer be bound to the physical anchor point of his corpse-like body. He will then manifest in the warp as a god in entire. At that time, he'll be attacked by all four of the Chaos Gods simultaneously because they fear him and hate him and call him the Anathema. But if he's powerful enough, either alone or with support from Yin-Yad, Segurat, Cain, or the other gods that still exist, then he would actually sort of win an ultimate victory by restoring order to the warp and putting an end to this DMT hell altogether. And Yin-Yad basically aims to destroy Slaanesh to free all of the Eldar that have been tortured by Slaanesh for thousands of years. So we'll see. But that's kind of where it's at now.
Do you want to talk?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk more about your theories around what you think is going to happen and what is actually going on?
Well, I mean, since this will evolve in the near future, I can make some predictions and see if I'm right. I think the next Primarch to wake up is going to be Lionel Johnson. Lionel Johnson is the Primarch of the Dark Angels, probably my favorite Space Marine chapter, and he is alive, although nobody knows how or why he's alive. He's been lying in like a stasis-like sleep in their fortress monastery called the Rock, which is a spaceship made of their broken planet. So I think he's going to wake up next. I think at least one other Space Marine will probably return, and it'll probably be Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, but it could be someone else. So that's going to happen. I do think Yin-Yad is going to continue to wake up, but the thing with Yin-Yad is apparently there's some fucking sword, and the sword is in the Tower of Slaanesh, and they need it for some stupid reason. So it's, in order for someone to get that sword, they'd have to be a completely uncorruptible soul. I do have a theory about who could do that. There's a guy called Kaldor Drago who's been trapped in the warp for like a long time, and he's uncorruptible. Grey Knight. So he might be able to do that, and then they could bring Yin-Yad to life. But ultimately, the only hope is the God Emperor, and the thing is, if he dies, he will reincarnate, but in the period of time it takes him to be born again, a universe would be destroyed. So he has to be capable of sort of fighting a war in the warp while his physical body dies. Some people think he's already left his physical body and that his body is just sitting there, but he's already transcended to some higher realm. So I don't know. I can't tell you. Also, it depends what goes on with the Tyranids, and we haven't even talked about the Necrons, who have all been waking up.
Do you want to talk about the Necrons?
Well, the Necrons were the species that were fighting against the great old ones in the original War in Heaven. and they served star gods called the Catan, and they were trying to attain immortality, so they sold their mortal souls and bodies to live in kind of robotic forms. And they still have some primitive consciousness, but they're basically robots except for their leaders. And anyways, they've been slumbering in tomb worlds for millions of years since this ancient war, and now they're waking up, and they're, reestablishing their empire or whatever, and they're, freakishly advanced, because these are like the original, so they're very, very powerful technology. And right now, there's only a few of them that have woken up, but them waking up is a huge threat to humanity, but also possibly a good thing, because they seem to represent a force of order, and they actually seem to be enemies of chaos. They probably built the Cadian pylons themselves, so it's actually possible that the Necrons could end up, fighting against chaos. That actually seems fairly possible.
Cool. So you were saying that there's a heavier philosophical and metaphorical element to the lore that can be interpreted that is semi-biblical, semi-hero's journey-esque. Do you want to go into your understanding of that?
Well, sure. So first of all, the God Emperor of mankind is obviously a parable of Jesus Christ, basically, because he's both man and God, right? He's a God, but he's also a man. He's somehow both man and God, right? He is, in that sense, like Jesus. He suffers a wound. He's betrayed by one of his followers, right? Judas betrayed Jesus. The God Emperor is betrayed by Horus. He's wounded and tortured. Jesus is nailed to the cross and fatally wounded and speared in the side. The emperor is wounded by Horus and then interred on the golden throne. The golden throne is constant. He's constantly suffering in order to save humanity. Just as Jesus is being crucified to save humanity, the God Emperor is bearing our sins basically and suffering on our behalf. He's the light of the world, right? He is. Jesus is called the light of the world. Well, he's the light of the 40,000 world. He provides an afterlife and so forth. So in all these ways, he is essentially God and Jesus. And as for chaos, well, this is the 7 deadly sins, right? If you go to Catholicism, lust is Slaanesh, wrath is Khorne, pride and ambition is Zenith and Slaanesh, gluttony and sloth is Nurgle. Nurgle was actually a Babylonian god. So these are real human sins. And what it's talking about is, if you start delving into these sins and you go too far into lust or into wrath or into gluttony, you're going to literally lose your soul. You're going to literally become some kind of human demon, corrupted, possessed. That's all essentially real. It's a parable. Saying you have to choose. Are you going to worship God, right, as your protector, or are you going to worship these dark forces, make pacts with demons and so forth, which all comes from real history, right? The Goetia people literally did summon demons and make pacts with them and believe in this shit, sacrifice babies to them and all that. So it is basically real theology in that regard. Yeah.
Are there any, I'm losing my voice here. Are there any other metaphorical relations, maybe that aren't biblical, but maybe they are, but maybe not related to the Jesus parable?
Again, the whole war in heaven, that is from the Bible. It's 50-50 in the Horus heresy, whereas in the Bible, 33% of angels followed Satan in the war against God, but that whole concept is biblical. Other than that, I think the metaphors about psychic powers and how that work, I think is fairly accurate. I think we do have astral bodies. I think that emotions and psychic feelings and psychic powers have a resonance in some kind of immaterial world that overlaps with our world. That's why, if there's an area where a lot of murder happened, that's going to be like haunted or tainted with some kind of negative residue energy, or if it's a sacred temple, it's going to have some kind of positive residue energy. So there is some way in which that happens. And there are psychics, psychic powers like the ones in Warhammer 40,000 do exist, telepathy, etc. And there's all kinds of sociological metaphors because a lot of it's about the empire's bureaucracy and it's the ecclesiarchy and the ministorum and it's literally just like corruption and corrupt priests and corrupt governors and just human shit as well. But
So, do you want to open it up to questions, or is there anything
yeah,
else?
totally open to questions if anyone has. Yeah.
If anyone has any questions, go ahead and ask.
If not, that's fine. I've been ranting on for quite a long time, and I got most of what I wanted to say. There's infinitely more to it, but
It's so intricate and detailed.
Yeah.
yeah, and there's just infinitely more to it. Like it just goes on and on forever and ever into every weird little rabbit hole you can imagine.
How do you memorize all that shit?
If I'm interested in something, I don't have to try and remember it. I just remember it. If I'm interested in it, then I just remember it. And this is something I've been interested. By the way, I've been fascinated with Warhammer since I was a little kid. Like since I was a little child, I've been studying this shit. Like, I remember when I was in my cabin, I did so many chores so I could raise $100 to buy the Warhammer box set. It cost $100, which was like a fortune back then to me. And I had to do so many chores to get that box set, and I was just like a little kid at the time. But like I've been deep in, and still like I think all the time about it. Like I contemplate it, and like the art is amazing. The books are great. The video games are great.
What first attracted you to that when you first started reading it?
Well, it's the aesthetic. I mean, everyone loves it. It's the grimdark aesthetic. The shit just looks really cool. The Space Marines look really cool. The aliens look really cool. The chaos looks really cool. Everything looks really cool. It's like a science fiction toy soldier, fucking darks. It's way darker than Star Trek. It's way darker than Star Wars. It's like more realistic, but also more far out. It's the grimdark, like. It's cool. Like every kid wants to be a Space Marine, and it has everything. Like it has every kind of crazy alien, every kind of thing. It's great. And also, it's not written by only just one person or even a group of people. It's the collective work of hundreds of people, and it's just so there's really nothing else like it. Like even like the Lord of the Rings is still written by J.R.R. Tolkien, or Narnia is written by C.S. Lewis, but Warhammer 40,000 is written by dozens of people over a long time. So it's just and yet it has sort of like a unity to it. It's too dark at times. Like there's shit I don't like about it. It's too disturbing and too disgusting, but it's fucking cool. So
it seems like it has something for everyone, and it seems like it definitely has something for you.
Yeah, it's fun to talk about. It's just it's a lore, it's a legend. It's an evolving story.
For sure. Well, I think this is a good place to close it. Do you have maybe a final remark or two, Shogun?
No, just watch those videos I posted, the Astartes videos and the Inquisitor videos, just to get some of the aesthetic and the visual aspect of it. Read up on the lore, check out some of the books, read the Inquisitor Eisenhorn books. Those books are fantastic. I swear, like read the Eisenhorn novels. Those are very, very good books. I would, that's all I'll say about that. And thanks for listening to me geek out about science fiction for.
Yes. Thank you so much for coming on, Shogun. And what he was talking about was fan-made animations on online, which are very interesting as well. Please follow us on the Roundtable YouTube channel, the Roundtable Discord. Please follow us on the Roundtable Podcast their YouTube channels, and follow us on BitChute. And check out I'm so stoned. Check out everything, please. And thank you so much for listening. And you guys were great to our live audience. And we can now hop up to the roundtable